Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at another rendition of O Gott, Du fromme Gott, which translates to, O God, you righteous God. Fairly straightforward chorale, a couple of quirks here and there, but we're just going to hop right into the analysis. So one sharp in the key signature, we start on E minor, we end on G major. I think the overall tonality of this chorale is G major, however the introduction of this chorale is a bit ambiguous. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that we are in the key of G major though. However, because E minor is the focus of this first three chords of the chorale, maybe there's an argument to be made that we start off in the key of E minor. I could see that point of view, but because there's no D sharps, it's hard to make the argument that E minor is being or functioning like a tonic in this sense. But let's just start with the analysis. So E minor is our sixth chord. We have a passing tone here in the tenor, and then we go to E, B, F sharp, and B. I reckon this E is an accented or a lower suspension really, and it's probably a 9/10 suspension underneath the alto, making this D the base of our chord. That would make this B minor over D, which would be our 3 chord in first inversion. So 6 going to 3, that's a bit of transitive harmony as I've called it in the past. Typically we expect 3 to go to 6 under a normative, under a normal progression. But here we have 6 going to 3, and it makes sense because if a chord can go one way, why can't it go the other way, theoretically speaking. The next chord is D, B, G, and E, which is E minor 7 over D, which is 6/4/2. It's an interesting chord here. So this is really where the argument for E minor comes about. We have E minor going to B, which if it were B major would truly be its dominant, but it's B minor. So I think this is just a case where there's a little bit of ambiguity going on, and it's more coincidental than like a modulation in this case. But we do have a 6/4/2 chord, and we would expect this to go to a 2/6 chord, but instead of going to 2/6, it goes somewhere else. It goes to C natural, A, F sharp, and E, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5 over C, or 7/4/3 in this case. And when we compare that to a 2/6 chord, which would be A minor in first inversion, the only thing that makes it different is this F sharp. So the resolution does make sense. The bass resolves the way we would expect, but the root of the chord lies here in the alto rather than here in the tenor. So it's an irregular resolution in terms of fitting that two-part narrative that I've talked about. This idea that the root is typically a fifth below and the bass is down by step. We only satisfy one of those criteria, but we see we have seen 4/2 chords resolve in unusual ways in the past. This is not exceptionally unusual. We've definitely seen some exceptionally unusual resolutions in the past, but this one is relatively tame. And it also ties into the fact that Bach often plays with the idea of 2 and 7 being close to one another in terms of pitch content, but not really in terms of function. So 2 and 7 are often not necessarily used interchangeably, but used almost in conjunction with one another. You see sort of 2 morph into 7, when in reality 7 is what's being implied, or vice versa. 7 resolves to B, B, G, and D, which is 1/6, G major over B. Then we have C here, which is a non-chord tone, as well as E, which is a non-chord tone. But with G and with D, that's not really an analyzable chord, but 1/6 does take us to D, D, F sharp, and C. This B being not an accented non-chord tone, just a non-chord tone. This would make this a 5/7 chord, D7 incomplete spelling, but still a 5/7 chord nonetheless. Then our phrase ends with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, where we end with our tonic G, D, G, and B, which happens to be in root position. The next phrase is relatively straightforward. We stay in the key of G major and we end in a perfect authentic cadence. We start off with another G major chord. It's the same as before, so we don't need to reanalyze. Passing tones in 3 of the voices, which gives us a bit of like an A minor 7 vibe in passing, but it doesn't make a tremendous difference on the harmony. If this were an F sharp, I feel like I would mark it, but because it's happening off of the harmonic rhythm and the chord is incomplete, I'm not going to bother putting it on the page. But afterwards we have B, B, G, and D, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. Passing tones in the inner voices here, which leave us with a chord that'd be not traditionally analyzable. We then have C, G, E, and G, which is our 4 chord, C major. A little passing tone here in the alto. G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have C, D, F sharp, and A, which is D7 over C, 5-4-2. We would expect this to resolve to 1-6. However, we have the components of the resolution broken up over sort of 2 phases. The bass does resolve down by step, but on the next beat we get the rest of the chord, right? So if B lined up here on beat 4, we'd have B, D, G, and B. So the resolution makes sense, but the bass continues with this downward stepwise motion, where this A would be an accented non-chord tone, and it appears that we're resolving to 1. So 5-4-2 to 1. It does look like an irregular 4-2 resolution, but we've seen this in the past, and this isn't really all too irregular. It's just the bass is out moving the harmonic rhythm. So the resolution is there. It's just happening over, like I said, two phases. The 2 criteria that I was talking about here are being sort of introduced in a staggered fashion. But after our 1 chord, we have D, D, G, and A. Very common to see 4-3 suspensions over dominant chords in root position. G is in the 4-3 suspension, and E is sort of enclosing what the resolution is going to be, which is that F sharp. So we don't need to analyze the next beat because that's where the resolution happens. A little delayed passing 7th here in the tenor before we cadence on G major. G, B, D, and G. The next phrase is a little bit quirky. It still ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, but we start off with a secondary dominant, and it happens to be another 4-2 chord. It's A7 over G, G, C sharp, E, and A, which turns out to be 5-4-2 of 5, because A is the dominant of D, and we would expect that to resolve to 1-6, which it does. We have this little suspension here in the bass, but it resolves down. It's probably a 9-10 suspension under the melody this time. We have F sharp, D, D, and A. So it does resolve the way we would expect. This, in terms of D major, would be 5-4-2 going to 1-6. So the secondary analysis does sort of veil that a bit, but we would expect 5-4-2 of 5 to resolve to 5-6. Afterwards, we get E, D, F sharp, and B. Another situation here where E is probably an accented non-chord tone, harkening back to the beginning of the chorale, actually, where this is actually B minor over D, which is a 3-6 chord. 3 sort of operating as a substitute for 1 in this case. And then we have E, C sharp, C natural, G, and C, which is C major over E, that's 4-6. B is a passing 7th. E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get F sharp, A, and D, which is our dominant in first inversion. D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And C is a passing 7th, but coincidentally we actually have a fully analyzable chord here. We have F sharp, D, A, and C, which turns out to be a 6-5 chord, actually. So 6 turns into 6-5 by virtue of the fact that some of the voices swap. And wait, F sharp, D, A, and that A gets replaced with D here, and the A was doubled in both of these voices, so the D gets replaced in the tenor, in the melody by the tenor, and the 7th gets introduced when the secondary A turns into a D. So anywho, that resolves to G major, G, D, G, and B, which is, as we already know, our tonic and root position. Next phrase is going to take us to the key of D major. It's the only modulation that occurs in the piece. Oh, actually, that's not true. We do see another modulation in the penultimate phrase. But yeah, this is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major. we start off with the G major chord, G, D, G, and B, which is still our tonic triad, and I think this is our common chord here, where it's also operating as 4 in the key of D major, because we see C sharp in the next measure. We have G, we have C sharp, we have E, and we have A, which is another 4/2 chord, A7 over G, like the one we saw at the beginning of the previous phrase, and that resolves to 1/6. We have F sharp, we have A, we have D, C sharp is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and we have A. So in this case, this is a 4/2 chord that resolves just like the way we would expect. This time, it's the exact same progression as we saw at the beginning of the last phrase. However, here we are still in the key of G major. Here we're in the key of D major. So the Roman numerals are different, but it's the same progression. So 1/6 takes us to B, G, D, and D, which is G major in first inversion. That's 4/6. Then we have some non-chord tones happening off the harmonic rhythm. A, we have F sharp, and we have E with D, and F sharp is also a non-chord tone. So I guess technically speaking, there is like a 1/6/4 chord kind of happening here with the A, F sharp, the D, and this F sharp here. I will put that down because it is sort of happening in passing, even though it's very brief. And that takes us to G major. G, B, or sorry, E minor over G. Misread that E right there. G, B, G, and E, which is 2/6. And we know that Bach loves 2/6 and 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. However, we have some counterpoint going on, and similar to the previous phrase where we see a fully analyzable chord via the voice swapping, we have the same thing happening here with E, G, B, and E. So the chord does briefly turn into root position here, which is relatively uncommon. It's interesting that Bach reconfigures the chord to sort of work as a completely spelled chord. That takes us to D major over A, F sharp, A, and D, which is 1/6/4, and that's typically followed up by 5. We have A, E, G, and C sharp, which is 5/7. And typically there's a bracket that equivocate or links the two together because they're related to one another in terms of how they operate as a larger cadential unit. But the bracket doesn't really add anything. It's just the way that I learned how to do it in harmony. And then we cadence on D major, D, D, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic and root position. Okay, next phrase we actually get a mid-phrase modulation. We have the C natural to, I guess, cancel out the C sharps we were getting from D major. And then we get F naturals, which cancel out the F sharps that come from G major. So we're going to quickly move from D major to C major, but not in a distant fashion. We're going to go through G major. Ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. We start off with D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is still our tonic triad in the key of D major, but it's also our 5 chord in the key of G. We also have a passing 7th on the bass, and that takes us to G major over B, B, G, G, and D, which is 1/6, our tonic in first inversion, passing tone in the bass, and then we get this F natural here, very similar to how the phrase starts. So we have G, D, G, and B, which is just taking our chord and putting it in root position, but in the key of C major, it's also operating as our 5 chord with a passing 7th on the bass. Then we get E, E, G, and C, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. So we have this sort of sequential harmony going on here. That takes, after our passing tone, we have C, F sharp, G, and D. I reckon this C is an accented non-chord tone. It's really this B here that is the base of our chord, which would make this G7 over B, which is 5/6/5. And then we cadence on C major, C, E, G, and E. Tonic triad, root position. And our last phrase takes us back to the key of G major, ends in a perfect authentic cadence like we would expect. And I do think C major is operating like our common chord here, where it's also 4 in the key of G major. And this phrase is very straightforward. We go to D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is a 5 chord. And that takes us to G major, G, D, G, and B. Tonic triad, root position. Passing tone in the bass, C is a non-chord tone, D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have this little quirky section here. We have B, D, G, and C. And I think when we take the aggregate of everything that's happening here, the outlier is D. So we have B, C, E, and G. And I think here there's just some interesting sort of 9 turning into 7, the intervals happening in the outer voices, and this D is sort of operating like a reverse suspension. And I think what's really happening here is this is a 4-7 chord. However, if you look at this D as, if you look at this C as an accented non-chord tone, you could also analyze this as 1-6. I think that that's also a viable analysis. But afterwards we have D, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad and second inversion. That takes us to D, C, F sharp, and A. Actually, this being 1-6-4 kind of strengthens the argument that this is an implied 1-6 chord, because it's not uncommon for us to go from root position to first inversion to second inversion and just scaffold up the chord by reconfiguring it like that. We've seen that quite a number of times in the past, but I think just the way the counterpoint works here, it's a little interesting how the chord, it's hard to get an exact chord out of everything. It's like, is C, E, and C all non-chord tones, or is just this D a non-chord tone? That's where my brain goes when I think about this sort of thing, and to me this just feels like a C major chord, mostly. But from what we know about 1-6-4 chords, we expect them to go to 5. We have D, C, F sharp, and A, which is D7. G is anticipation to the next note in the melody, and then we cadence on G major. G, B, D, and G. Tonic triad, root position, and that is today's analysis. Really, the 2 takeaways in this chorale, at least for things that I'm looking for in my overall analysis of the chorales, is the fact that there's a mid-phrase modulation here and a handful of, or not even really a handful, it's just a couple of questionable 4-2 resolutions, namely this one right here where 6-4-2 resolves to 7-4-3 rather than to 2-6, even though they're very similar chords, and this one right here, which is not one that's completely alien to us. We've seen it before, but it is kind of, when you look at it on the page, it does look like a red flag, but in reality it's easily justifiable as to why it works out, and it's not traditionally irregular. That's kind of interesting, traditionally irregular. And I think this chord right here where the bass and the melody sort of swap voices is kind of interesting as well, where this 9th on the outside turns into a 7th on the outside, and made analysis a little bit quirky for that part. But other than that, this chorale is fairly straightforward. I think I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.